Our next speaker is a wonderful man. I had the opportunity to interview him yesterday. He is a nationally known speaker. He's an amazing man, and the way he knows history is something really special. How I wish I had somebody like this when I was in school. You know, Dr. Carson said tonight when we were interviewing him, you know, you can't get enough knowledge. I am in awe of our next guest. His latest book is called Miracles in American History. He wrote a fascinating book about the Quran, about what everyone should know about the Quran. He's just fascinating to listen to. Give me a warm welcome, because he's going to cut his time short with us out of consideration tonight, Mr. Bill Federer.
Well, I want to tell you a story to help you to appreciate how unique America is and the moment that we are at right now. I have often heard people say America's the greatest country in the world. I decided to prove it. So I spent several years researching every civilization that has ever existed on planet Earth and found some interesting things. Did you know that the first human records appear about 3,000 or 4,000 BC? Sumerian cuneiform on clay tablets in the Mesopotamian Valley, today that's Iraq, and Egyptian hieroglyphics on papyrus, where we get the word paper. And so, 2,000 or 3,000, 4,000 BC, and we're around 2080. So you add that together, that's around 6,000 years of recorded human history. And in a sense, 6,000 years is not that long. 6,000 years is just 60 people living 100 years each back to back. How many of you have met someone who's lived 100 years, or maybe close to it, maybe a grandma? We're talking 60 grandmas, and you're all the way back to the beginning of recorded human history. Now, the question I asked myself was, what is the most common form of government in all of 6,000 years? You know what it is? It's kings. Now, they go by different names: Pharaoh, Caesar, Kaiser, Sultan, Tsar, Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Attila Hun, Genghis Khan. But you know the most powerful king in world history was the King of England. The British Empire controlled 13 million square miles and 500 million people. The sun never set on the British Empire. It controlled all of India, a quarter of the world's population right there, Australia, New Zealand, the Bermudas, Canada, the Americas. And we decided we're going to break away from this centralized power of this king, and we have no army, no navy. And so we have many miracles, and that's why the book, Miracles in American History, how we got free. But I want to tell you a story that maybe you're not familiar with. So we had a revolution, France had a revolution, and they got a leader named Napoleon. He conquers in Europe. Napoleon goes into Russia with 500,000 men, comes out 6 months later with 50,000. The Russian winter and all the attacks, well, he's forced to abdicate the throne. Once Napoleon is out of the picture, the British have an army and a navy that, gee, they want to know what to do with. And so they decide to send it over to America and maybe try to take America back. And they're inciting the Indians. Fort Mims, Alabama, the British supplied them, the Red Stick Indians, with guns, and let a rumor out that they would pay in gold for American scalps. 500 Americans are scalped at Fort Mims, Arkansas. And then they're supplying Chief Tecumseh, and then they are sending a fleet to Lake Erie. And we have 28-year-old Oliver Hazard Perry, and he puts our ships in the lake at Put-in Bay, Ohio. And most of his crew are free blacks from Ohio. And the British have their one-armed Robert Barclay, this captain that fought Napoleon, and he has long-range cannons. And so he's firing the cannons, and he splinters to pieces Oliver Hazard Perry's flagship, the Lawrence. They expect him to raise the flag and surrender. This gutsy young guy gets on a rowboat and goes over to his second ship, the Niagara, and lo and behold, the wind changes directions. He sails directly in front of the British line, firing every cannon away like a madman. When he gets to the other side, the smoke clears. He had disabled the entire British squadron. Never before had an entire British squadron been disabled at one time. And he tells his men on deck, the prayers of my wife have been answered. And the victory allows us to take back Detroit and all the Northwest Territory. He writes a letter to the Secretary of War saying that the hand of providence has shown itself in the battle. Well, then the British decide that they are going to send 4,500 British troops to Washington, D.C. And we have our troops just sort of run away. And British Admiral George Cockburn comes into our U.S. Capitol. And Dolly Madison was in the White House. They were about to have dinner. James Madison is out directing the troops. And so Dolly Madison takes the portrait of George Washington off the mantle of the fireplace. She is riding out of town while the British ride in. They go up to the White House. They go inside, see they were about to eat dinner. This British Admiral George Cockburn sits down, eats dinner, and then torches the place. And then he goes to our U.S. Capitol, has his men sit in the chairs of our congressmen. He goes to the Speaker's chair and says, who votes to burn the Capitol? They all say aye, and they torch our Capitol and the Library of Congress and the Treasury and the Navy Yard. And then the wind picks up to a frightening roar. By the way, just before this is when our president, James Madison, had a day of prayer. And then the day before Oliver Hazard Perry's conflict, he had another day of prayer. And so we have the nation praying. The British Admiral is there, George Cockburn, and the storm picks up to a frightening roar, slaps horse and rider to the ground. Lightning begins striking the British soldiers, knocks off roofs and chimneys. The tornado even picks up British cannons and throws them yards away. And this British Admiral exclaims to some lady, "Great God, madame, is this the kind of weather that you're accustomed to in this infernal country?" To which the lady replied, "No, sir, this is a special interposition of Providence to drive our enemies from our city." Well, the British were driven out. 2 of their ships were blown ashore. After this is when James Madison has a day of fasting and prayer. A British historian said, more British soldiers were killed by this stroke of nature than by all the arms the Americans had mustered in the feeble defense of their capital. So the British decide to go a short distance away to Baltimore, which happens to be the home of our speaker that we're going to hear from in just a minute, Dr. Ben Carson. So the British, Baltimore is the 3rd biggest city in America, and they decide to fire their cannons away nonstop for 25 hours, 1,800 cannonballs. And the storm system that had dumped all that rain on Washington, D.C. had moved over Baltimore and dumped so much rain that Fort McHenry, it was an earthen fort. Well, most of the cannonballs sunk in the mud. And so the next day, September 14th, 1814, the sun comes up, and Francis Scott Key, who had been doing a prisoner exchange, he saw the flag still waving, and he wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. And you're all familiar with it, but are you familiar with the 4th verse? And as a matter of fact, coming up this Sunday, September 14th, 1814, it's a 200-year anniversary of the Star-Spangled Banner this Sunday. But I want to read to you, I want to share with you that 4th verse. And let's listen to the words because they apply to what we're going through right now. It starts off by saying, "And thus be it ever when free men shall stand between their loved home and the war's desolation. Blessed with victory and peace, may the heaven-rescued land praise the power that has made and preserved us a nation. Then conquer we must when our cause it is just, and this be our motto, in God is our trust. And the Star-Spangled Banner in triumph shall wave over the home of the free and the land of the brave." Ladies and gentlemen, we are a land. Out of the 6,000 years of world history, we have been entrusted with the freest, most prosperous country, with the most individual liberty than any nation has ever had on planet Earth. And it's slipping through our fingers like sand. And Proverbs says, a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. But one of the things we see in history is that God seems to always wait till it looks hopeless. And then he raises up a little nobody that's small in their own eyes, but big in faith and courage, and he uses them to deliver his people. And I'm convinced that Dr. Ben Carson is one of the great leaders that in our time of crisis that God has risen up, and God is going to move in our country.